for years as a designer. She has done just about everything from artificial intelligence and holograms to robots and research and development. Today, Jody works in the office of the Chief Technology Officer as a principal design researcher for Microsoft and is the founder and CEO of Superhuman X. There, where she works to understand the future of human-machine interface by working on brain-machine interface, sensors, robotics, artificial intelligence, and augmented reality and virtual reality. Jody also travels around the world, speaks about the future of these technologies and their impact on humanity for groups like Wired, Google, and TEDx. So she's also a CCS alum. So please join me in making her feel welcome today, and thank you for your time.
Awesome. I'm so happy to be here. We are actually in the same room together, so I'm a little bit cheating right now because I can see you sitting right across the table from me. Anyways, so thanks for joining us today. The way that we'll take questions is through the chat, and so keep your questions loaded. I'll address them at the end unless there's something extremely pressing that you want, and then our wonderful student moderators here will help us to facilitate that questions. So to get started, so I'm going to talk to you today about the future of human-machine interface, and specifically around how augmented humans are going to play a role in that future. To begin, we really need to recognize that we are on the cusp of an entirely new computing paradigm known as cognitive computing or artificial intelligence or perceptive computing. There's many different ways that people phrase this, this next wave of compute. But if we look at sort of the history of compute, we see that the mainframe compute was disrupted by the PC around about 1984, and that what happens with technology is that you get this sort of exponential pace of technology. That means that tech doubles in capabilities every year as the price for compute drops by about half in that same time period. And that's what we refer to as the exponential pace of technology. Now, this is mostly referred to in Moore's law. Gordon Moore was the founder of Intel, and he realized that the power of transistors doubled every couple years, and so that's why it's called Moore's law. Now, Moore's law is not just limited to transistors. You'll hear that a lot, and it involves any type of technology. And the way that it enters that doubling pace is the minute it becomes digitized, it starts to double in its capacity every couple years. In fact, now that couple years has been shortened to about 6 months that we see a doubling of compute power. Now, like back to my original thread here. So the mainframe was disrupted by the PC around about 1984. And you'll see that these make up these like S curves that make up the full ramp of that exponential pace. And so what you see is that every time a technology kind of reaches its zenith and it can't really do much more, there's some technology waiting in the wing that's ready to take over. And so you see that happening here where the PC overtook the mainframe. Now, we are in a similar situation now where the PC is starting to level out. And instead, what we're about to see is that cognitive computing, AI, is starting to take the place of the PC. But as you can see here from this diagram, it hasn't surpassed where that's going. So that's why we're just on the cusp of it. It hasn't quite reached mainstream. The reason for that is rather simple. Each one of these breakthroughs in the paradigm came with a human-machine interface breakthrough that allowed for many more people to be able to leverage the power of that compute. It started with the mainframe. We had HMI that was about encoding data. The PC is about operating software. And for AI, it's going to be an HMI that helps us to collaborate in real time with AI. So let's take a quick look at that around the history of HMI. And we'll look at that first portion. The mainframe was developed in 1899, and that's when we developed something called the punched card. Now, for those of us who are old enough to remember those little like tests that you had to take where you had to color in the little circle, that was a punch card. And basically where we developed that was from the jacquard loom. So the first mechanized weaving looms developed in the UK. We leveraged that method of programming a mechanization and used it to encode data for the mainframe compute. Now, around the 1950s, 1960s, we started to introduce command line language. In fact, Microsoft Basic was one of the first command line languages. And that came along with a form factor change of the mainframe. And now we had a keyboard attached to a small little monitor that acted as almost like a smart piece of paper. And you would type in the code instead of encoding it on the punch cards. In around 1970, Douglas Engelbart demonstrated the mother of all demos at Xerox PARC. And the mother of all demos was a breakthrough because Douglas Engelbart introduced something called the mouse. And that ergonomic change to our interface allowed us to change how humans and machine interacted. And we introduced the graphical user interface, also known as the guided user interface, which basically, instead of us having to encode, to sort of write software, instead we now were able to operate software through images and languages. So basically the images and language shortcutted all the code that you had to learn how to write. Now, Apple Macintosh commercialized this in 1984 with the System 1. And it's important to note that back in 1984, the types of software that this was developed to help us operate was WordPerfect, AutoCAD, that you see there on the right, and spreadsheets. Those were the three types of software that you could operate back in 1984. Now, since that time, two things have changed and one thing did not. The first thing that changed is that hardware deconstructed. It's no longer contained in this cute little box that you might be looking at. Instead, compute has exploded, right? Now we are looking at IoT and what we call edge devices that are basically like, sensors and phones and smart monitors and all sorts of things like this. So it's exploded all over the place and it's not contained in this little box. It's exploded into the real world. In fact, if you look at the pace of compute, we see that there's only 2.1 billion PCs in the world versus nearly 8 billion IoT and edge devices in the world. And that number is expected to double by the end of 2022. So we are on an exponential pace with our edge devices. The other thing that this enabled is that because the compute has exploded, AI is now embodied and acts autonomously. What I mean by that is it's no longer inert. It's able to move in the real world and take action on the real world on its own behalf. Now, the other thing that changed is that we are doing very different computational tasks today. Since 1984, we have seen a dematerialization of things that used to be material objects. It started with things like spreadsheets and calendars. And then quickly in 1994 came the advent of the internet and stores started to dematerialize and communication dematerialized. And then 2006 with the advent of the iPhone, we started to see books dematerialize and clocks and watches and calculators and measuring tapes and music and all sorts of things started to dematerialize into our computing device. It's so significant today that we have about 77 zettabytes of data, which is 2 stacks of books from here to Pluto. That's how much data we have under our control today. So much so that Mark Andreessen famously said that software is eating the world. Literally everything in our environment, from this water bottle to your own body, has some sort of a digital twin somewhere that is a technological version of that object or person. So if that's true, if software is eating the world, then AI is actively eating software. Right? So all remember those 3 types of software I talked about in 1984, Word, AutoCAD, and Excel. Well, now AI is capable of doing all of that for us. We don't have to operate those software. Word has become natural language processing. AutoCAD is now generative design and digital manufacturing. Excel is actually the basis of machine learning, okay? So our software has completely disappeared, and we no longer have to write software. OpenAI has proven that we can use AIs to write its own software. So we don't have to operate software. We don't have to write software. What we have to do is collaborate in real time with artificial intelligence. Now, that's scary to a lot of people. They hear that and they're like, and they've seen lots of movies and they've read lots of sci-fi books and comic books, and they're like, oh my God, AI is going to kill us. And I can see why that happens, right? Because we have this popular culture vision of AI, and the way that we measure AI is often by something called parity metrics. And what that means is that we measure the AI's effectiveness against humans that do that same task, right? You may have heard about AlphaGo. AlphaGo was developed by Google to play the game Go, which is a really, really complicated game, much more complicated than chess. In fact, most people that play Go play it by feel. They don't, it's not, it's really about feeling what you should do in the moment, as opposed to like logically thinking it through. And we thought that no way an AI could ever do that until AlphaGo beat the world's best Go players repeatedly in competition. And so that set up this idea, well, that they're going to be better than us. But that's not actually what happened here. Humans didn't stop playing the game Go all of a sudden. What happened is that humans saw the way that AlphaGo played, which was radically different than how humans played it, and then they adopted that methodology, those strategies, and improved their own human games in the way that they play Go. So it's better to think about the human and AI as a collaboration between humans and what James Evans calls alien intelligence. Now, the reason he refers to it as alien intelligence is because humans are really good at sort of free-form, creative, improvisational thinking. Yeah, and like, I know we're all creative people on this call, but even, you know, the least creative human among us is much more creative than a computer, because they can walk and chew gum at the same time, which is a highly creative activity, right? So it's more like, an AI, on the other hand, is really good at statistical thinking in structured environments, and especially at rote activities. So things that are very predictable. Whereas humans, well, we excel at the real world, right? We can walk. Robots can't. I know you're going to be like, oh, I saw the Boston Dynamics video, Jody. They can walk. They only got it right half the time, and there was a human piloting them the whole time. Sorry to disappoint you, but that's true. Okay, so humans excel at the real world, whereas robots keep falling over, right? The problem is with our collaboration is that we're terrible at communications. Humans and machines, we suck at communication, because the one thing that didn't change since 1984 is our HMI. We're still using the guided user interface that relies on pictures and images and waits for the human to tell it what to do before it does it. This is entirely set up for us to operate software. Now, that means that only a few people in the world, less than 0.1% of the world. Actually, this number is wrong. It's only 29 million people that know how to code out of a world of 7.8 billion people. Our tools are what Heidegger would call unready to hand. What I mean by that is that you have to spend so much time focusing on that tool that you don't actually do the task. It's very present in your hand, right? Versus something that is ready to hand, where it just sort of disappears into your hand. Our technology is unready to hand. Let's take a look at GPS, for example, okay? So GPS is a great tool. I love GPS. It takes me all over the world to weird places I've never been before. But the problem is that when you're driving on the wrong side of the road, sorry, Ian, in London, and you are trying to circumnavigate a roundabout, which most Americans have never seen, you're not just doing that, you're also driving a car on the wrong side of the road and using the stick shift on your right hand, or on your opposite hand than what you're used to, right? So now I should be paying attention to that driving problem, but instead I'm paying attention to my map. That means I'm not doing one task, I'm doing two tasks at the same time. And unfortunately for us as humans, we suck at multitasking. Anytime you add one task to another, you cut your ability to do either by half. That's because we have very limited working memory. That's your short-term memory, your task-based memory. And it's designed so that when you switch context, your brain says, oh, we don't need this information, and it dumps it to prepare yourself for this new context and a new set of tasks. It's often, anytime you switch context, you create an interruption in that thought process, which is often called the doorway effect. And it works like this. You're sitting on your couch and you're cold, and you're like, oh, I need a sweater. So you go to your bedroom and you walk through that door and you think, why did I come in here? And you usually don't remember why until you walk all the way back to your couch, right? That is not you getting old. That's not something wrong with your brain. That's just how it works, okay? And any time you interrupt your brain, whether it's walking through a literal doorway or switching between your phone and driving or trying to get past that tricky Twitter tab as you're going to another tab in your browser, you're creating an interruption in your thought process that can cost you anywhere from 0.3 seconds to 30 minutes to get back to whatever it is you're doing. And to give you an idea of the size and scope of this problem, yes, you touch your phone 2,600 times a day. That's 2,600 times a day that you're being interrupted for in whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish, okay? That's pretty significant. And that's just on your phone. That doesn't take into account your computer or anything else that you're doing digitally. Now, because of this, HMI is actively killing our brain's ability to think. In many studies, we have found that the human brain is starting to develop this very staccato rhythm to its thinking because it's being kept in this like really noisy short-term memory space. And it's not allowed to get to that deep creative thought that our human brains are designed to do. So it's time for a new HMI that allows us to collaborate in real time with AI. And what we really want is computing at the speed of thought. We want to be able to think something and have the compute respond, right? Like that's everybody's kind of like magic dream, is to have like Harry Potter like capabilities, but without all of the weird J.K. Rowling problems that we have, right? And so nobody wants to wear this weird helmet on their head with all these wires sticking out, but we want something like that. So the question becomes, how do we think? Well, we look at the real world because of something called perception. And if you're curious about this, I highly recommend you taking a look at this book, The Case Against Reality. It's very well spelled out there about how perception works. And it boils down to the human brain uses senses and movement. I know you've heard that old wives' tale that we only use 10% of our brain. That's not true. 10% of our brain is dedicated to language and second order processes, very conscious things, but the majority of our brain is actually processing senses and movements. In fact, humans embody our cognition. What I mean by that is that we think with our entire body. If you're stuck on a problem and you go for a walk, you're twice as likely to solve it. If you're taking handwritten notes in class, you're twice as likely to remember that content because you're using more of your body in the thought process. In fact, you have just as many neurons in your gut as you do in your brain, believe it or not. Now, we already know how to make tools that work with embodied cognition through something called ergonomics. Now, ergonomics reduce the effort to input while amplifying the output. You know, like a really well-made like a really well-made hammer. It sort of just like disappears into your hand. It's what Heidegger would call ready to hand. It disappears. You don't think about the tool. You just swing your arm and you're busy focusing on your other fingers and trying not to hit those and hit the nail instead, right? So with that effort, the hammer amplifies that effort and makes it more than just swinging your arm at that nail. And anytime that we create a radical ergonomic change, we enable radically new human capabilities. Let's take extreme sports for an example. Here you see a water border, a water ski border, and prior to adding this ramp, which is often called a kicker, that skier would have had to have superhuman abilities, really defined abilities to be able to ski along the water and then leap himself into the air, right? And so much effort would be put into that lead up that once they got into the air, there wasn't much they could actually accomplish. So what we do is we introduce this ergonomic change called a kicker. And now it's not about the activity is not about leaping into the air. It's about what you do when you're in the air. What can you do then? And suddenly whole new opportunities unlock, because now the effort is not getting into the air, it's doing tricks in the air. Let's take a look at how this works. So it took us 19 years to take just 2 seconds off the world record in speed skating. And round about 1996, we introduced something called the clap skate. And I remember this very clearly. Apollo Ono introduced the clap skate at the Olympics in '96. And what it was a simple ergonomic change. Now there was a hinge on the front of the skate, and the back of the skate was able to kind of like the skater could lift their heel up off of the skate. Before that, both of those points were fixed. What that ergonomic change did was it allowed the skater to push and sustain that push a lot longer than if the skate had been attached to their ankle. Okay, and in 2 years after that, we took 2 seconds off the world record in just 2 years versus the 19 years prior. And that world record was broken 4 times in that 2 years. So what's the kicker for AI and cognitive computing? Well, allow me to introduce you to embodied computing. Embodied computing takes all those IoT devices and edge devices, and rather than containing them into a little box, we wear them. We put them around space. Now now compute is something that we wear, and we operate with our own bodies by movement, by looking, by doing these things. And so that includes things like mixed reality, exoskeletons, biosensors, brain interfaces, all sorts of things that we can put on our body. And here's what it does for us. This on the left is the Robonaut 2. It's the first humanoid robot on the International Space Station. And it's a breakthrough in robotics, let me tell you. It can do all sorts of things. It's a pretty spectacular robot. What's most interesting about this robot for the purpose of this case study is the hand. The hand is really dexterous, very powerful, and can also do very fine-grained movements as well as gross movements, which is something that most robot hands can't accomplish. Now, see that dude sitting over there on the right? Yeah, he's writing computer code that will control that robot. And as you can see, there's a lot of weird code happening on that screen over there. Now, he had to have a very advanced computer science degree to be able to control this robot. GM saw this robot hand and decided they wanted to give this to their workers, right? But rather than having to teach all of their workers how to be computer scientists, they took that robot hand and they turned it into a glove. So the whole robot hand is now put onto my hand, and I'm wearing an exoskeleton. And the way I operate it is not by writing computer code, it's by doing this. I simply move my hand like I would normally move my hand. And with the effort it takes me to lift 5 to 10 pounds, I can lift 15 to 20 pounds. And I can do it all day long without ever getting tired. That is what embodied computing does for us. It allows us to control it like it's our own body. Now, we can do that same type of thing to our brains. We can adapt systems to match the way that our brains take in information by creating sensorial interfaces. So this is called cognitive ergonomics. And there's only a few practitioners like this in the world, but it's a growing practice. Key to us is something called something that we work on a lot is XR. So XR is extended reality, mixed reality, AR, VR, all of that. And XR is to AI what the monitor is to the PC. And the way that it works is it allows us to see through machine vision to the real world. It allows us, in other words, to embody computer vision. Now, let's look at how important vision is to us. So, vision is incredibly important to us as human beings. It takes up about, it makes up about 70% of our sensory mix. And if you take your hand and you put it on the back of your head, it's okay, nobody can see you. I can see you though. Yeah, that's about the size of your visual cortex, and it's pretty huge, and it's implicit in it's on both hemispheres of your brain there. So it's a really important thing. And it's so important that it makes up 85%, or it's innate in nearly 85% of our cognitive abilities, those things that I was talking about that operate in the background. Yeah. And it's what we use to triangulate all of our other senses: touch, smell, taste, sound, all of those. We triangulate through the senses, right? So what we hear, what we see tells us what we're hearing, seeing, smelling, right? So when we hijack that with digital vision, we see some pretty tremendous brain activations. For starters, we can transcend pain. So researchers at University of Washington's HIT lab were working with burn patients returning from Afghanistan. Now, these folks had burns over nearly 60% of their body. And as you can imagine, they were in excruciating pain. It was so bad that morphia only reduced their pain by 20%. So what the researchers did is they created this VR game. And the first thing that you see is cold. So the brain says, oh, that burning sensation I'm feeling, that's cold. I'm not burning, I'm cold. And the second thing that happens is they trick the patients into throwing snowballs at these poor little penguins and snowmen. And for some reason, Paul Simon plays. I don't know what Paul Simon's about, but apparently it's important. And it distracts the brain just enough so that the patients received a 60% reduction in pain. So morphia 20, VR 60. And what's more impressive is that unlike morphia, which is extremely addictive, VR actually trains the brain to do this visualization all on its own, so that when these patients are experiencing pain, they don't have to put the VR on. They just have to close their eyes and visualize this scene and get the same amount of pain reduction. Now, as if that wasn't enough, we can also use virtual reality to rewire the brain. Now, this is my friend James Blaha, and he has something called diplopia. What that means is that he has a lazy eye, right? So one of his eyes is not, the brain's just not paying attention to it. So in the real world, he only has 2D vision, right? So he has no depth of field. And it used to be that we believed that after the age of 12, there was nothing that you could do for a lazy eye because your neuroplasticity ended, or so we thought, at age 12, because that's when you go through puberty and your brain stops growing and changing. At least that's what we thought. Now, James was in his 20s when he wanted to do something about his lazy eye, well past 12. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, kid, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. I can do a surgery so it doesn't look as odd, but it doesn't matter. It won't change what your brain sees. You're stuck. So James, being stubborn, didn't believe them. And he went home and he created this game that you see here. It's actually called Vivid Vision now. If you know somebody with this and you want them to be able to do this, you can download it. And what happens is there's a slightly different bit of data coming to the lazy eye as to the working eye. And that slight bit of data is essential to gameplay. And what happened after a couple of months is that James started to be able to see out of his lazy eye in VR. And then once he took it off, he could see in the real world too. He had fixed his lazy eye and rehydrated neuroplasticity. Now, that's incredibly important. So let's keep that in mind. For the interest in time, I'm just going to kind of like glide past this next part if you don't mind, and I'm happy to talk to you, anybody who wants to talk about it later. But touch is another thing that we can actually amplify. It's one of your first senses, and it colors your vision of the world for the rest of your life. You learn when you're a baby that hard is bad and, soft is good. And that colors how your perception goes. If you're sitting in a hard chair, you're twice as likely to think I'm full of shit as if you're sitting in a very comfortable chair right now. So tactile sense is very important to us. And when it comes to the blind, it's basically how they navigate the world, right? They replace vision by tactile sensations. That I don't mean that literally. I mean that they use touch instead. And so what we are able to do is to help blind people to see again through tactile efforts. And so this is Emily, and she's wearing something called the Brain Port from YCAB. Now, the Brain Port is that little tablet that you see there that she's holding in her hand, that white piece of thing, and she's about to put it on her tongue. And she's wearing a pair of glasses that have a camera mounted to the front. What's happening is that camera is translating that image into a black and white 100 by 100 pixel thing that can be displayed on a vibrotactile tablet that she puts on her tongue. So it's got like little prongs that poke out or in, right? And with this, it's kind of like a cochlear implant for blind people, okay? Helps them to see. So what happens is that it allows them to sort of taste sight. So this is what the display is. And what they are able to do when they put this on their tongue is they're able to read, they're able to differentiate between faces, they're able to play soccer, they're able to move around in space because they claim it helps them to like taste sight. They can actually see things in high definition. Okay, so the more that we complete the embodiment, the more amplified the human capabilities become. Let's take, for example, the Walk Again project. So Walk Again project was developed by Dr. Nikolai at Duke University. And what they did is they were working with 8 paraplegics, so people that had lost control of their legs through some sort of accident to the spine. Something had happened that severed the connection, the neural connection between their brain and their legs, and they were now paraplegics. Now, the part of our brain that controls the legs is called the M1 neuron. That M1 neuron runs from ear to ear, kind of like a headband. And there's different parts of it that control different parts of body parts, from your eyes to your lungs, to your arms, to your legs, okay? And the part that controls your leg is just above your left ear, just above there. So what these researchers did is they put an EKG cap on top of the people, and they specifically put a sensor on that part of the M1 neuron that controls your legs, okay? Now, their intent all along was to enable these patients to control a pair of exoskeleton legs with the same synapse that you and I use to control our legs, okay? That was their stated goal. And the first thing they needed to do is to train those patients to be able to kind of like consciously stimulate that part of the M1 neuron. In the same way, if I told you to move your leg, you could do that, okay? And so what they did was they hooked up a pair of VR avatar legs, and they learned how to control those avatar legs. Once they got good at that, they added the exoskeleton, right? So now they're seeing it, and now they're also actively moving the legs with this exoskeleton, okay? And something really weird started to happen. After about 6 months, all 8 patients regrew the musculatory and circulatory system necessary to walk. And after about a year of treatments, all 8 patients had voluntary leg movement without any of the apparatus on. What happened as an accident is that they had managed to help these patients to regrow a neural connection between the brain and the legs to enable walking. Now that's pretty spectacular, right? So this new way of interacting with computing, this embodied computing, actually gives us superhuman abilities. And I mean that in the full Superman sort of way, right? Superman didn't control his powers with a little control panel. He just moved his body and it was amplified. It was magical, right? So this type of HMI does that for us. It significantly reduces interruptions. It improves our mental performance, and it allows us to leverage our innate cognitive abilities to control technology while providing real-time collaboration with AIs. Now, AI is coming, but it's not here yet. As you can see here, the exponential curve shown in yellow, that's what I was talking about earlier with the pace of compute. And then there's our linear bias. That's where we expect it to be able to do. That's what we expect, that's our estimation of where these technologies should go. And unfortunately, we're about here right now. It's in this disappointment phase, as we call it. But the future is going to be driven by quantum AI and XR. And XR really is that first step towards this embodied compute. It allows us to have one-to-one interactions with our digital twins, and it allows for us to have real-time collaboration in AIs with other people, with other systems. And it also allows us to do things like teleoperation. Like I said, robots are not good at the real world now, but if humans are involved in training it, in driving it, what happens is that those AIs become a lot smarter and they're able to help us faster. You're going to see an amplification in productivity that's going to be really significant. In fact, Bell Helicopters said it designed its helicopter 10 times faster thanks to VR. And it actively amplifies learning because neuroplasticity is absolutely critical to learning. In fact, Lockheed Martin found it reduced their training times by 85%. That's because it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert at something. And the more exposure you have to the real world situation, the better you are at doing it. You build up a sensory understanding of what needs to happen so you can get into flow state. So it's good for hard skills as well as soft skills. And COVID-19 is really amplifying this movement pretty quickly. Actually, last year, my team and we developed an arts education platform on virtual reality because all of our students had to go home due to COVID and we lost that in-person collaboration. So we created one in VR, which was pretty successful with RISD, we did it. And then the other thing that we're building is something called holoportation, which allows you to kind of teleport and be physically present with people, even though you're just an avatar of yourself. All right, so if it's in that disappointment phase, what's it going to take to reach that good enough threshold? And when is that going to happen? Well, it's going to be around about 2030. And we're already seeing the ways that we are able to kind of do that. In fact, we have this new, I don't know if you saw the announcement the other day from Facebook, they have these really great AR goggles or glasses that they came up, which are incredibly wearable. They look just like a regular pair of glasses, no big difference. So 2030 is where we're going to start to see things move into this chaos and amazement phase that is common to exponential technologies when it reaches that disruption. That's when we're not going to understand what the heck is happening because it's going to be so different than our world today. We're going to see adaptive computing, and already you can play some of these games such as Nevermind, which is an emotional gaming app. Basically what it does is the goal of the game is to keep your emotion very calm, and it does everything it can to make you stress out. And so the more calm you become, the more frantic and like scary the game gets. We're going to see full sensory augmentation, meaning that we'll have olfactory, which we already have in kind of like lab settings, but it's not ready for prime time, as well as tactile interfaces. And then we're going to see everyday exoskeletons. And in fact, already the tools that I showed you in that Duke University example, those exoskeletons are way more affordable. In fact, I just bought an exoskeleton for $1,000 for my lab last week. So it went from being, hundreds of thousands of dollars down to $1,000, and it's dropping. The price is dropping more and more rapidly. We're also going to see some crazy things like native BMIs, such as the one being developed by Elon Musk and Neuralink. But that's pretty far away. I'm happy to dive into that if you want more information on that. But I think what's really cool is that we're going to start to develop new senses because humans have a very limited perceptual spectrum. In fact, dolphins studied, I worked with a team out of Georgia Tech, and they were trying to communicate with dolphins, and they were doing this thing where they would put a sonar in the tank with the dolphins. And they took a dolphin and they put him in another tank. And then they recorded what happened when they put him back in the tank with the other dolphins, and they 3D printed it. So what they found is that actually when a dolphin goes to its friends, it's sending a 3D diagram of that space, a full 3D image of that space. So when they put him in the other tank, they put him in there with a diver. And when they try to 3D print the sound that the dolphin made in the other tank, this is what they 3D printed, a diver in the round pool. So we're also seeing things like being able to hear colors, such as Neil Harbison. You're going to be able to sense north, such as my friend Liviu and Cyborg Ness. And Moon Rubus actually can anticipate earthquakes, which is very helpful coming from California. She can feel them starting in her feet, so she knows before they happen. But XR is going to be the first step towards all of these things, towards a world of embodied cognitive computing that allows us to have computing at the speed of thought. My question to you is, what are you going to do with your superhuman abilities? Thanks. All right, so now we can open up to questions. My favorite part.
So I'm going to help facilitate the questions with Wes. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and we'll say them to Jody so she can respond. I can start and ask like a kickoff question just to get the ball rolling. So actually, you mentioned Neil Harbison and Moon Rubus. I actually heard a talk from them a couple years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I like saw them in person. They're pretty cool. And I guess my question for you is there a difference between this embodied computing and like what someone considers a cyborg?
I think the big difference between cyborg and embodied computing is the intent. So a lot of times cyborgs are trying to become transhuman. They're trying to move beyond the human form and become something else. So I used to work for Ray Kurzweil, who wrote The Singularity is Near, and he's the director of engineering for Google's AI platform. And he's also a transhumanist. And what they're trying to do is they want to become compute. What I see here is I don't want to become a computer, and I have no interest in that's not what I want. In fact, I talk a lot about how I want to make superhumans, not supercomputers. And so I would say that a cyborg is a supercomputer, whereas what I'm talking about here is that it actually amplifies what makes us human. It amplifies our innate human capabilities. It doesn't replace it. Right. It just amplifies that capability. Yeah. Yeah,
and cyborgs are like this middle ground of like trying to transcribe what they're experiencing on Earth and then like stuff that's happening in space or actually connecting with the computer itself.
Right. I think a lot of times like cyborgs are, a lot of the people that work on cyborgs and cybernetics are really interested in that kind of like, how do we move beyond the human form? Right. And I think that's a problem because our brains are the human form.
Right.
And so if you try to like remove the human form from the equation, our brains are only going to be like 10% as functional as if we have all of the ability to move and sense and all that kind of good stuff.
Right, and I think Neil said that he was colorblind.
Yeah, he's colorblind.
So,
Yeah, my friend Adam Montag actually created that for him. And he's colorblind. And so the way that they figured it out is that they realized they could do, they could translate color spectrum into sound frequencies. And then what's happening, Neil has a chip, for those of you that don't know, Neil has a chip in the back of his brain right here. And there's like a camera that kind of, that's that antenna that you saw, it kind of comes up over his head and there's a camera here, but it's basically just a color camera. And what happens is that it's playing the sound waves of that color spectrum. So like when the, so basically what it is like transcranial sound in here. And so he can actually see in all kinds of spectrums that humans can't see in, such as like infrared and those types of things. So it's pretty impressive stuff. And my friend Liviu from Cyborg Nest, he's the guy with the chip in his chest, and it's a vibrotactile chip. And basically he can sense where north is because he has this chip in his chest. So anytime he's facing true north, he gets a vibration. So it's being used in like military applications for navigation purposes. Pilots use it, hikers will use it, that type of stuff. And I asked him, he had it removed because he was having some infection issues. And I was like, dude, did you can you always sense north now? He's like, unfortunately, once I removed the chip, I can no longer sense north. So I was hoping that it would like develop some sort of like human capability, but it did not.
Huh.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I'll continue with the questions in the chat. So a question from
Courtney, she said, with the future of XR and AI, do you foresee there being any key negative downfalls or results due to their existence? I'm sorry.
Can you say that again? I need to actually, let me just go to the everyone chat and then I can see what's happening there. Wait, can you repeat it one more time? I'm not seeing it for some reason.
So with the future of XR and AI, do you foresee there being any key negative downfalls or results due to their existence?
Okay, so there's a couple of problems with XR. So when I was working on the HoloLens, so I was principal designer at HoloLens, which is Microsoft's AR, right? And one of the big problems that we had is I convinced all my friends and families, they'll tell you I conned them, into putting on a GoPro camera on their head and walking around with it on for a week so that I could see kind of what our cameras would pick up. And at first they were kind of, smart about it. They would take it off when they changed clothes or when they went to the bathroom or when they would argue with a spouse or whatever. And then they forgot that they were wearing it. And I got to see things you should never know about your friends and family, things that nobody wants to see, right? And so like, that's one of the big things that we are currently working on is understanding how to maintain privacy and data dignity in these types of situations. I will also tell you that I worked for a certain 3-letter agency, government agency, and they were thrilled with it when I told them that I could actually reprogram your brain, because they were like, oh, does that mean that we could, change what people believe as reality, kind of like they used to do with LSD in some of those experiments at the military. And that's true. You can do that. And you can do it accidentally. In fact, some of the first VR video games were horror games, and people were traumatized by them. On the flip side, you can also cure trauma with them, because one of the main cures for PTSD is exposure therapy. And you can use VR to do exposure therapy in a way that's very, very safe. And you can put them into situations that you could never replicate in a therapist's office or something like that. So I think those are some of the big concerns that I have, is malicious actors messing with your brain, and also the big privacy concerns that we have there.
So that was Courtney's question. I'll jump on to a question from Melanie. She says, what relationship do you see between the idea of everyday exoskeletons and the future of fashion?
Ooh, that's an awesome question. Wow. Well, I have a friend named Tilly. Tilly was an amputee at age 2, and she was double amputee, both arms. And she is the inspiration for Alita, the battle bot. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but she is stylish, man. She's got like different blades for different purposes. Like she's got her blingy arms, she's got her like totally functional arms. And all of that is something that she can kind of control with her own brain synapses. So it's not like it's like right now, if you wear a prosthetic, it's pretty like inert, but these were actually like, she could really use them, similar to how you and I use our arms and legs. But it was all about, for her, because she's in her teens now, so it's all about looking cool and being cool. There's also a group, my friend Scott Summit owns I think they're defunct now, but it was a group called Bespoke, and what they did was they were 3D printing prosthetics to be aesthetically pleasing for the wearers, for all kinds of purposes. They also were doing like casts and stuff like that too. So lots of really cool stuff. And oh, one more thing that I saw, I got to tell you this, because I think Melanie, you'll love this. My friend does manicures with sensors and IoT devices. And so they do like prosthetic nails, just like you might get at, nail tech kind of place, but now they have like technology embedded in them. So you can do all sorts of things with that too, but I'll stop nerding out on that for now. Susan Laporte, if you're interested in data dignity, I highly recommend checking out my colleague Jaron Lanier's books. He's written quite extensively about data dignity and how we could start to think about that.
Awesome. So Pam is wondering, so she says that a lot of this seems very scientific. So how do we approach something like this with no scientific background or qualifications? And how do you give your designs credibility?
All right, so here's where I tell you that I am not a technologist. I don't write any code. I don't do anything having to do with code. In fact, the way that I do this is that I create analog prototypes. Entirely analog prototypes, and then test those out with humans. And then I give those analog prototypes to developers to turn into code. And the other thing that I do is I work with a lot of co-conspirators. That's what I like to call them. So I work with cognitive scientists, biologists, people that are expert in these areas to help me understand sort of the scientific side of things. And then a lot of what I'm doing is the human side of things. How does this feel to you? What does this accomplish for you? And I do a lot of very deep immersive research where, and rather than doing it in a lab setting or something like this, I just kind of go and I hang out with people and I watch what happens and I watch what we do. And then we try to use these things in situ to see does that help or does this help? For example, when I was working on the interface to Big Dog from DARPA and Boston Dynamics, the first big robotic mule that Boston Dynamics created. What I did was I was working with soldiers, and the training for it was they had to learn computer science, they had to write code on a PC laptop and operate it with a Xbox controller. So now let's put this in situ, right? So now they're in the field, they're in theater, they're getting shot at, and then they open up this big laptop which shines a big bright light on their face, and then they got to be like, please don't kill me, I got to write some computer code and I'm going to control it with this. Not going to happen, right? And so what we did was I mounted the head of the robot on an ATV, I drove it around, and I watched what kinds of things we could pick up from the humans in the field, and we found that they make these gestures to communicate to one another. And what we did is we trained the robot head to detect, I worked with engineers, and they trained the robot head to detect those gestures. So it's more about putting these things in situ and testing them out with real humans, because we're not trying to create computer interfaces. We're trying to create human interface for the computer to respond to. And so it's much more about that side of things than it is about the technology side of things. Yeah.
Awesome. So Maria Luisa first of all, she applauds you on your presentation, and she wants you to expand on the important ethical issues emerging from these scenarios.
Oh dear, there's so many ethical issues, right? I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I worry about is who has access. Right, is it only the top one, the wealthiest 1% that are going to have this access, or is it going to be everybody? And so a lot of the work that I do is I specifically work with people outside of the existing market. So for example, I lived in India for a couple months, and I worked with women in the slums, and I just kind of lived with them and observed sort of what life was like there, which was highly analog. And I was doing this for Intel. Intel wanted me to come up with the next big patent for them. And they wanted me to do that with, for women in particular. And I was like, well, why don't we do it with people that are outside of the ecosystem today? So what I did is I worked with these women in the slums, and I I observed how they live their lives. Like, what is it that they need? What do they do? And then to prove to Intel that the PC interface was not the way to go, I taught these women how to use computers. And I annotated everything that wasn't working for them. And what we found is actually that everything doesn't work about a PC if you've never seen a PC before. And if you haven't seen an office before, you don't know what a file folder is. And if you don't speak English, a QWERTY keyboard makes absolutely zero sense, especially if you speak Hindi, which is a phonetic language. So what we did is we created the RealSense patterns, where we could pick up gestures and things like this with them. Another effort that we're doing right now is I used to run an incubation lab at a place called Singularity University. That was Kurzweil's place. And we worked on the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, so things like hunger and health and education. And so my colleague Hla Win from Malaysia, she was really concerned about the education that her fellow citizens were receiving, because their textbooks were 40 years old. So it was really antiquated education. And so through observation, she realized literally everybody had access to a phone. They just didn't have access to PCs. And so what they did was she created an phone-based AR tool, and they printed these postcards, and they sent these postcards around to people all over Malaysia. And what happens now is that they get state-of-the-art education through this machine vision-based AI tool that allows them to kind of like leapfrog the education that, like, say, even we are able to provide our students, because they're actually getting lessons from Finnish instructors in their, even if they're in a remote village in Malaysia. Okay, so that's one big concern I have, is about who has access, right? Are we creating a bigger gap between the haves and have-not? The other one, though, is really about the data dignity, because all of these systems run on data. So I am part of a committee it's called the Partnership for AI. It's run out of the Bay Area, but it's a partnership with tons of massive institutions around the country and around the world. And what we are working on is the Prosperity Initiative. So our intent is that, if you're going to take my data, you better reward me for that data exchange. It's not that you just take it from me, like you rob me of my data. You have to give me a share in whatever it is that you're building. And if you're going to automate me out of the job, then you better make damn sure that the way that I can easily educate myself to be part of this new economy. And in fact, you should really think about interfaces that come to me, that I don't have to learn it. So let's say, like, machinists are very concerned about robots taking over their jobs. And they're concerned because in order to program a robot, you have to have a computer science degree. But what we're working on is an interface that allows them to take all that machine knowledge that they have and use direct manipulation of robot arms to program the robot. So instead of having to write code, they take it by the hand and they program it like this. So I think those are some of the biggest ethical concerns that I have, is around those things and around the privacy issue. I think that privacy issue is a really big thing. Yeah. Hope that helps, Maria Luisa.
Awesome. We have a question from Matthew. He's saying how, as we merge technology and the body, what is the concern that we create two different types of humans, those that can afford these superhuman technologies and capabilities and those that are unable to?
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of getting at, is like, how do we embrace the Moore's law, which allows for these things to become cheaper and more prevalent? And so actually one of the things that is kind of central to my design practice is that rather than starting on a PC, because only 2.1 billion people have a PC or access to a PC, and not all of those people have access to it daily. So instead, I'm looking at the tools that meeting people where they are. So using like smartphones and these sort of really inexpensive wearable wearable technologies. For example, in Africa, there's a group in Kenya that's working with subsistence farmers. So farmers that are like literally that's the only way they can stay alive is by farming. And what they're doing is that these farmers, they've learned their lineage from generations of fellow farmers, and but big holder farms, they can use all kinds of AIs and things like this to help them to become more efficient farmers and to get better yield from their crops and stuff. So what they're doing is they've created a series of really low cost sensors. We're talking sub 5 cents per sensor. And then they have a machine vision based AI. So basically what you can do is have you seen those plant identifier kind of machine vision apps? Yeah. So you take a picture of whatever's going on, and that goes to the cloud, and it comes back in a picture tutorial of how to solve that problem. And then they can put these really inexpensive sensors in without having to know how to connect them. And they just take a picture of it, take a picture of it, take a picture of it, and it creates a network for them. And then they can also use a language-based interface to ask more specific questions. And so what's happening is that it's increasing the yield of these farmers. It's helping them to take advantage of all this AI intelligence that we have. But and in fact, we also created a thing where you can put your phone on the soil, and you can diagnose what's going on with the soil, find the water content of the soil, et cetera, et cetera. So we're using these very, very, very low cost ways to bring people into this AI environment. And there's a lot of work happening in that, not enough. We need research institutions, schools like CCS, et cetera, especially since we're in this middle of Detroit, where there is a lot of poverty here and in Pontiac and some other surrounding areas. We need these types of institutions to really be looking at how we can democratize these tools and ensure that it's not staying in the hands of the wealthiest 1% of the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's very important. I'm gonna ask if there's any more questions. Feel free to keep sending them in the chat. But right now I'm gonna pass it off to my colleague, Wes, who's sitting here with me. He has a question for Jody.
Hi, Wes. I can see you across the room.
Sure. I can't unmute, so I'll just ask here. Yeah, so my question is kind of overlap with Pam's. So as an interaction design student, this XR seems a little different from our current education. For example, we had an interface design class, which is basically about GUI. But once XR becomes mainstream, how do you think interaction design education will change?
How do I think interaction design will change?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, XR changes interaction design. I mean, all of these technologies change interaction design. Right now, interaction design is how do I train a human to push the right buttons in the right order to do the task? What this does is the complete opposite.
Right.
It's how do I provide the context through sensors and other types of things to the compute to successfully predict what the human is trying to accomplish, and then start those processes so that when the human's like, that's what I want, it's doing it, right? So that's how interaction design is going to change. It's about how do we craft these experiences that enable the human to know what's happening and why, and instead, train the compute to do these things. So really the job of the interaction designer becomes an ergonomic thing. It's about the cognitive and physical ergonomics. So it's more about creating sensory experiences and physical movements and matching the way that the physiology works or matching the way our brains work to enable us to leverage these powers when they become available to us. So I think, instead of training humans what to do, we're crafting human experiences that are pleasant, that are desirable. It's really going back on those human-centered design principles and really driving those home for the user. Yeah.
To me, that sounds a bit like neuroscience, more kind of like a medical and science field. Would you say that's right?
The question Wes was asking is it more like neuroscience? I would say that I can't read it. I would say that it's not neuroscience. It's more about neuroscience is a background of it, but I think neuroscience is a background for all of the for UX in general. It's just that it's not always like top of our mind, right? It's baked in there. But yeah, I mean, it's less neuroscience and more about sensory experiences, which are, does that feel good? Do you know what that feeling is? Can you differentiate between this feeling or that feeling? I would say it has a backing of neuroscience, but you don't have to be a neuroscientist in order to do it.
So core of interaction design is not change. Like it won't change. It's still about the user experience.
It's still a
just
design
like,
practice,
vice versa.
right? It's still a design practice. So he was asking if it changes the practice, but I think it's still a design practice because it's more like a lot of times when I talk about XR, I say, listen, it's more like designing magical rooms full of magical objects than it is about creating buttons on a screen. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think that's more along the lines. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if there's any further questions, I know Jody's happy to answer them. Oh, yep, there is another one. So Sonia's coming from the auto industry, and the question is, when one sense is compromised, such as vision, leaning into your other senses, can you envision your other senses and provide capabilities to control the machine in the vehicle?
If your vision, if your senses are compromised. Well, I think, you know, a lot of the thing that's happening with vehicles is that a lot of that human is responsible for the driving is starting to kind of ebb away. So it's not about like making sure the human can see the road. Like right now, cars are designed so that the human has 10 and 2 eyes always on the road, always alert, always awake, always driving, right? And so when I was working with Toyota on the iCar, that was a kind of a huge shift for Toyota to think differently about what is the purpose of the human in the car in this instance. Because there are still instances where the human's going to want to drive, but for the most part, it's not going to be essential from a safety point of view that the human do the driving. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I guess what I'm saying is I think that it kind of the equation changes because now you have AI on board that can kind of like understand what the human's doing, what their needs are, and what their focus level is, and act on their behalf if they're compromised. Say they get something in their eye, or they're somehow lost a limb or something like they have some sort of amputation or something like that. Now we can change the mechanisms of that vehicle.
Awesome. So we have a question from Julie. She's asking if you can comment on the SO group spyware Pegasus technology and how pervasive this type of malware is already happening, and what the promiscuousness we could potentially face going forward. What recourse do we as private citizens have to counter such invasion of our privacy and data?
So I'm not is that the one that just was released on Apple? Is that what you're talking about?
Julie, was this one that was just released on Apple? She said yes, and then she said envision minority report kind of law enforcement happening.
Oh, yeah. So minority report type things are already happening in China. I don't know if you know that. So they're using predictive law enforcement. You're more likely to cause crime, and so we predict that you're more likely to do a crime, so we're going to take action against you preemptively. So here's where it becomes about human actors versus technology. Any technology in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. Any technology in the right hands can become a tool. It's very, very much about is very much about sort of that, is about that. And I think that there's also something that we need to note here, which is that you can't legislate these things. So for example, the US, we were very anti human clone or like stem cell research, right? And so we put laws into place to prevent stem cell research from happening. But what that means is that there's no voices in the conversation that are skeptical or who are cautious or anti human fetal cell testing or stem cell testing. And so what happened is that countries like China and a few others, they didn't have those legislations in place, right? And so what happened is that people that were interested in that kind of research gravitated to those locations. And so they did a lot of work there. In fact, I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, it came out that someone in China had engineered a couple of twins, genetically altered them. And, you know, that's something that, you know, from the American appetite was highly like distasteful. But from a Chinese perspective, it was highly beneficial because they have different value systems, they have different objectives. And so I think that you have to be careful about how you legislate things, because if you say there's a moratorium on it and you make that very pervasive. Now, I don't mean to say that China is a bad actor, but I'm saying that it could be that if you regulate it too closely, if you prevent it, then suddenly only bad actors can take an action. And then you're creating more of a problem than if you had allowed for that type of stuff to happen. So it's very much about how it's a bigger ethical question than it is like, is technology good or evil? Can you legislate this away? And yeah, there's kind of an interesting question here from Patricia directly to me, is how much was my work about exploring the potentials of these technologies versus understanding what are the problems we should solve? It's very much 50-50 for me. I do a lot of work. The majority of my work is what problems should we solve and why are those problems? Why are they something that we should work on? As much as I work with technologists to understand the potentials of these technologies. Where can we go? What's possible with this tech? What can we do with it? So I work with researchers at like Stanford and University of Washington and Columbia in New York and some other folks, and as well as Microsoft Research, which is basically a research institution, to understand the potentials. And then my job is to focus on the human beings and what actual human problems there are and how we might be able to solve those problems, rather either technologically or otherwise. So it's a little mix of both.
Cool. Well, if there's any more questions, feel free to drop them. But
or you can also reach out to me directly. My email is jmedich@gmail.com. So please feel free to reach out to me there or LinkedIn or wherever you happen to be. And Leslie, and I'll follow up with you about the invite to the Metropolitan Museum. That sounds really cool. Oh, all right.
so this has all been so fascinating, and I know I look forward to the future of human-machine interaction. I just want to thank you for your time tonight and sharing your knowledge with us, Jody. Definitely look forward to visiting CCS in the future, and hope everyone enjoys their evening.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Hope to talk to you soon.